Hi everyone, I'm here with Ian Parry today, who's the CEO of Future Leaders. And Ian, I know you've got a huge amount of experience with both leadership, but also in the utility space as well. So we're going to chat a little bit about that today and really pull on your experience. And I know you also do a podcast as well, and we should give that a plug. And we just recently did a fireside chat with What the Future. And I know we were talking about collections there, which was you interviewing me. So this is quite nice in terms of reversing the tables within a week, really. Although you did describe me as rather bleak, which I thought was quite funny. I think it's the first time I've been described as bleak, but maybe that's an accurate description. I don't know. So we'll try and make this one more upbeat. So definitely for sure.
Yeah, and I think it was the message that was bleak rather than you being bleak, Chris. But hey,
Yeah, so anyway, I'm sure this one will be way more upbeat. So it'd be good to pick your brains, I suppose, this time round around what some of the key themes that you're seeing, particularly in the utility space, because I know you do a lot of work there, and collections, but also say energy and water, etc. And what are some of the key themes that you're seeing in your conversations?
Yeah, I think we're still seeing a lot of effort around balancing cost to serve with delivering service, certainly, as well as identifying vulnerable customers. There's a huge amount of regulatory pressure, certainly in the energy market. The water market are going through their price review process right now as well, so there's quite a bit going on there also. And obviously in the energy market, there's a lot of chat around the losing of the force fitting of prepayment meters, which is a loss of a collections consequence. So I think there's a number of different themes there. The cost to serve thing, certainly a huge and significant one, has a knock-on effect to the price that people can offer, as well as the service that's been delivered.
How do you think that's, particularly with, I suppose, economic, we've had energy prices increasing for consumers at least, anyway, I'm talking really around particularly the consumer market, but also for businesses. In the light of cost to serve and potentially increased volumes coming through, how's that sort of manifesting itself in terms of stress within these businesses? In terms of like, how are they actually going to manage that? How are they managing that today? And what are the dynamics, I suppose, you're seeing in the businesses?
Yeah, so I think the trading teams, so these are the teams that are physically purchasing the energy, that's gone from a back office, not really much is known about it, to very much a front office, almost front page news item, really. I don't think many people knew much about hedging in the energy industry that weren't part of that part of the industry up until recently. So certainly I've been involved in setting up a number of new energy companies. And what I've learned is if you've got your trading right, if you've got wonderful talent in the door from a trading point of view, and you've got your commercial strategy right, and that is you are buying at the right price, you are understanding your customer profiles, and by that, their usage, when they're using it, and what seasonality looks like, and therefore you can buy at the right price and secure your sort of ongoing tariffs then for customers. If you can get that right, it absolutely and unfortunately dwarfs the cost to serve challenge, because you can talk about reducing how expensive it is to run each customer, but if you get that commercial trading bit wrong, then you've lost. And we've seen that with 20 plus of some really good companies going bust over the last couple of years. I mean, if you think of the likes of Pure Planet, for instance, they were really well-backed organization with BP as a really interested partner. And when you've got the likes of BP and Shell exiting the UK retail market because they just don't see the long-term profitability, then you've really got to worry, and you've got to start thinking it isn't about throwing stones at these individual companies and saying these individual companies need to do better. There's something missing there that perhaps we need to change.
Do you think I know there's quite a lot of issues when we had the crisis. We had a lot of fallout with companies, basically exiting the market. Do you think the hedging piece was a big part of that for some companies, at least anyway, in terms of whether they were hedged correctly? Do you think some of that stuff's calmed down somewhat? And then we're now into almost like it's price caps versus the price of energy, which is almost like the bigger issue now rather than the hedging piece. Is the hedging risk side of things under better control?
I would say mostly yes. To your first question, was it one of the biggest reasons for companies going under? Yes, absolutely. Alongside as well with the price cap, what it meant was that those that hadn't hedged far enough into the future were buying energy and losing hundreds of pounds per customer on every single day of trading. You've essentially got a situation where, if you put it into other retail contexts, where you would be stopping Tesco's from selling their tomatoes at the price that they were buying it for. So we're not even talking about profit here, we're talking about loss on every single customer. And therefore, unless you've got some very deep pockets, and this is why you've got BP with billions of pounds of profit being made, they're walking away from this situation because they can't see that it's a profitable market to be in. So yes, hedging was a big issue. Yes, I think we've come out of the worst of it. And certainly what we're seeing is Ofgem, the regulator, are putting more controls in place now. So when they regulate, obviously, new companies coming into the market as well. And for the first time, certainly in my living memory, we saw Ofgem refusing licenses to retail domestic suppliers coming into the market for reasons of not enough collateral and not enough experience, not enough sort of trading expertise within those businesses. So I think they're getting a little bit of better control over that now, because it's pretty clear that they were not having their best day, so to speak, while that was going on.
One of the interesting aspects, particularly in the energy industry, as I was looking through all the different suppliers, is the increasing dominance, I suppose, of renewable supplies. And then if you look also at what's happened in Ukraine with the war in Ukraine and the reliance around hydrocarbons within Europe it feels like that there's an increasing emphasis on solar panels or wind or and that's becoming an increasing proportion across Europe, really, as a result of energy security. Do you think that will change the energy market going forward, and particularly for energy companies as well? Is that the future we're looking at?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is a future where generators of energy become individuals like you and me. So we become generators. Now, what we're seeing is that the national grid aren't necessarily set up for that. So they're going through a huge change as well. So when we think about the energy in this country, it's not just the energy that we consume, it's the way in which the infrastructure is built and how that is fit for purpose going forward. So, for instance, if you've ever driven past a wind farm and that it's a wet, windy day, but it's not going around, the turbines are not pushing around, very often that can be because the grid isn't able to take the electricity that's being created onto the grid at that time, because they just cannot deal with that surge. So they pay the wind farms a lower rate to essentially turn off the turbines. Now, we need to do something to be able to take that energy, and there's a number of projects going on at the moment where they're building offshore sort of large batteries that are being set up on sort of old LP gas tankers, take that energy away from the wind farms, store it until the grid can take it back on. So when you've got a situation where obviously we need to get to this point of net zero, everybody's doing their bit, but if the grid physically cannot handle the energy and the green energy being created, it's got to be stored somewhere. So for me, it's a combination of storage capacity, the way the grid is being moved forward and taken into the future, and engaging with us as not just consumers anymore, but also generators.
It's interesting how there's almost like an extra layer underneath, in terms of it's not just the generation, but then also that the lumpiness of that generates other issues, and its infrastructure and those kind of things, which isn't always immediately obvious, I suppose, when you actually get to think about it.
Yeah, certainly. There's such a lot of art around the idea of a time of use tariff. So you've got kind of day and night rate meters that are in place in some places. But I think what we'll see in the future is far more time of use tariffs, where the grid and your retailer will be rewarding you for not using or not consuming from the grid, that is, at peak times.
Yeah.
That's generally seen as between kind of 4 and 6, 7 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah.
If
Oh,
you're
yeah.
not consuming.
Yeah, I'm still living in I think my mind, I'm still living in the 1970s where there used to be peak electricity usage due to boiling kettles during the middle of Coronation Street. I think it was those kind of things, which isn't
Yeah.
really helped by solar power in the winter. But,
No,
but
but it's that's the principle. It's
yeah,
looking at how do we stop ourselves from taking
smooth
from the
sailing.
grid during those peak times.
It's very interesting. And then from a consumer point of view, we've obviously they're under economic stress as well. Just last week, we had inflation figures come out. The energy price seems to have moderated somewhat, but are you seeing that flow through in terms of impact of consumers? I know we talked before around things like vulnerability and financial stress. What are you seeing or hearing there?
Yeah, so it's not really flowing through yet. So we saw
Mm,
that So Energy, for instance, came out with a new tariff, I think it was last week or the week before, that was a couple of £100 below the price cap. But then they quickly had to remove that because then
mm,
there was a lot going on because of air condition usage, and therefore the sort of the gas price started to spike again. So they had to quickly take that off the market. So I think we're still quite a bit away from that continued price down. I think we're still sensitive to some volatility in the market, and
mm,
therefore consumers are not going to see a huge kickback to where we were during the pandemic or even pre-pandemic. And of
mm,
course, we've got to remember that the best energy retailers are buying their energy months and months ahead of time to create security, to create stability in their prices. You can't expect them to do that. And then as soon as the prices drop, they've got to implement that into their tariff, because that
mm,
just isn't going to work. They built a tariff that says, hey, Ian, if you can guarantee to use roughly within the profile that you were using, we'll go away and buy that energy from the market. And then at this price, they bought it in the marketplace. And then
mm,
once you've used that, they can renegotiate your usage back into the market. But you
mm.
can't really expect them to layer any reduction in that when they've gone to the market and already purchased the energy you're using.
Yeah. So you get this lagged effect. It does feel like, just from an individual consumer point of view, it feels like it was expensive at the start of the year. And I know we've had issues in terms of like price caps, the subsidies coming to an end, those kind of things, but the price is coming down. Over the summer, I mean, certainly my energy use goes down significantly. At some point in the autumn, I'm going to have to turn it back on again. I'm a little worried about that sort of autumn into winter period in terms of like how much of a shock we're going to have and how much do we need to prepare now from a consumer treatment point of view within the companies around what might be coming down the pipe. How much of a concern do you think that is? Here's me being bleak again, but how much of a concern do you think that is after the summer? Will
Yeah,
we have an issue in the fall?
and I think we because of course, if you remember last year, there was lots of chat about
Mm,
organised blackouts from the grid, and they
mm,
were publishing these sorts of plans that gave rise to quite a lot of people buying like mini batteries to keep their work life going while they were working from
yeah.
home as well. So I think we're going to see higher prices for quite some time yet, at least for another cycle of winter, albeit that they're not going to be as high as what they were. I think what we also are seeing now are people really taking control of their energy usage. So we saw last winter, one of the reasons why the grid didn't have to implement some of these plans is because people's usage really tailored off. Now, in some
Mm,
instances where people are vulnerable, that's not a good thing,
mm,
because if people are living in a situation where they're choosing between heating and eating, and they're putting extra jumpers on, or maybe they're living in damp conditions, and that's not a great picture. But I think at a
mm,
macro level, what we saw was less usage, and therefore that saved billions of pounds from the government's point of view, because they didn't have to
mm.
go out to the market to buy that energy. So I think we're seeing it, as you suggested, we're seeing it tail off a little bit. But I think that this next winter is still going to be a risky period. We're still going to see energy companies trying to do more for their prepayment customers. And certainly what we're seeing at the moment are more and more people fitting into this financially vulnerable cohort that have never been in there before. They just don't
Mm.
know what services to access, they're likely to be feeling a lot more uncomfortable engaging in these conversations. So I think we have an obligation as a energy and water industry to reach out to these consumers in a compassionate and understanding way. So we're making people aware of the services that are available to them and making the sign up to those services super, super easy so that we're not making people jump through lots of hoops. So I think it's using the data, not just credit reference agency data. We should be looking to engage with government agencies and even having conversation between water and energy providers, because there's certainly a crossover there from a geography. Obviously, the water companies look after a certain geography, energy companies not so much, but there'll certainly be a crossover where they can share some information.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that's notwithstanding any privacy and data regulation, but I certainly think your intention is to help the consumer, then you should really be able to get beyond some of those challenges. So there's that side of things. Certainly, specifically to energy, then there's a lot of work going on for prepayment customers, and there's been work going on for a number of years for prepayment customers where they have self-disconnected. Now, what that means is that the customers run out of money, they're not topped up, and they run out of their emergency credit. The regulator, and there's a lot of activity within the industry to contact those customers as soon as that happens, to check in and say, hey, is there anything we can do? And they're certainly asked to top up those meters, particularly if they're smart meters and they can do remote top-ups. There's ways in which you can do one or two sort of occasions where you might offer the customer some more top-ups. But of course, you've got to find a good balance there, because you don't want to put the customer further and further into debt because of the situation you're in. So there's certainly a balance. And I remember when I was head of collections for one of the other retailers, and you've got this kind of picture in front of you where you have some customers, they're having a prepayment meter fitted, and then because of the repayment rate and the size of the debt, they could be in debt with you for 10, 15 years into the future. And you think, that's just crazy. It's not a mortgage. It's not some sort of huge loan. They've just struggled to pay their energy bill through credit, and now they find themselves with a 10 to 15-year obligation to pay back their energy company. And I just think you've got to find a balance there between, again, going back to the cost to serve, going back to the fact that consumers that owe their energy company money are adding to the cost to serve, which adds to the cost that those that pay on time every time will have to bear.
And I suppose just talking about prepayment meters, people are often on prepayment meters because they have had financial difficulties elsewhere, or they have financial difficulties, so they're struggling keeping up with payments just generally, I would think. So it's a way of the energy companies then guaranteeing that they can then get paid for the energy that's used. But I think the servicing of those tends to be more expensive. And I think is that price differential, is that now more equal than it used to be? Because I remember it used to be higher if you're on a prepayment meter than if you're a direct debt customer, you're a great credit risk and all of those kind of things. But that almost exacerbates the fact that I've got less money, but then I'm also paying more for my energy as well. It just doesn't feel right to a certain extent.
Yeah. So there's probably a couple of things here. I think the industry hasn't done a great job in explaining some of this prepayment stuff. So number one, the way I would describe it is that a prepayment meter can be a lifestyle choice. Some customers like paying by prepayment, and that's how they like to do it. They can control and they can budget, and that's great. Others, as you rightly say, weren't able to handle credit as a payment method and got themselves into trouble and got themselves into debt. Now, the prepayment meter is a way of keeping them on supply and keeping their supply live, whilst also managing their debt and their ongoing commitments. And there was a number of years ago, what we saw was the industry switched from disconnecting customers. And if you look at the number of disconnections these days, you're talking a handful of customers that would be disconnected. So you saw the industry going from this situation of disconnecting people to essentially, if they could see there was somebody in the property, and quite often when they're doing these disconnection visits, they won't know if there's anybody in the property. And some of the
Mm.
properties they visit, it's quite difficult to tell if there's somebody living there or not. But they will most times then put a prepayment meter in there to secure the ongoing supply. So I think there's
Mm.
a security of ongoing supply to be considered there. Now, traditionally, prepayment meters were more expensive to run because you had multiple top-ups per week, for instance, which has a cost associated with them. So if you're a customer going into a post office or a pay zone or such, then the cost of that payment, there's like a commission attached to that, a cost attached to that goes directly back to the supplier. So they have to pay for that top-up. Now, you can imagine if you're a prepayment meter customer, you may top up maybe 3, 4, 5 times a month, whereas a direct debit customer, you're doing that once. Equally, the cost of the sort of the handling of that customer tends to be higher. They tend to contact you more. Those meters can break down more often because of the usage through them. So the overall cost of a prepayment meter traditionally was higher, and that's where the tariff and of course, the risk of non-payment was higher with a prepayment
Mm-hmm.
meter customer and the handling of debt and the debt provision. So yes, traditionally they've been more, but you can look around these days and you'll find some prepayment tariffs through some retailers are just as competitive as the direct debit tariff.
Mm.
So I think you can broadly say that prepayment is still a little more expensive, but you can find deals out there to balance that out, albeit what we see is that prepayment meter customers are disengaged mostly from that switching cycle, and it's quite difficult to make sure that they get the best prices they can.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, I suppose, if you look in the financial services space with fintech and all of these sort of like top-up sort of mechanisms, which are very popular, things like buy now, pay later, and just whether how much of that can translate across into the energy sector to try and take some of the cost, those extra costs out for people. And then I suppose you've got all the potential government support sitting in the background of priority schemes, services schemes that would really help with some of those customers as well, subsidizing as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, definitely. I just think it has been demonized, but it's a tool, it's a method to ensure that consumers get to keep using the product because it's a necessity
Mm.
and they have the debt that they've incurred
Mm.
managed going forward. So that it's something I think it's easy to get some headlines out of some of the situations that the energy companies have got themselves into. But I would say, broadly speaking, it's a necessary product that needs to be there.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. Obviously, there are media headlines around force fitting of prepayment meters. What's been the fallout from that? Because it sounds like what you said earlier is a lot of companies have stopped doing that, and is that resulting in other issues? And is it really the right thing to do, despite what happened? Because it didn't look good at the time, but is it the right thing to stop doing it?
Yeah. So again, I go back to how we explain it as an industry, what sort of PR that we do, and it's a tough one to fight back against the headlines, because the headlines are debt rep says that he loves doing his job, he loves disconnecting people, and that's not what was said. So you've got to get past some of these things, and you've got to get past the fact that quite often once you get to the door with a warrant of entry, there's been maybe 20, 30 opportunities that the energy company has put in place to contact that customer. So if you've gone through 20, 30, 40 touch points and you still haven't had any engagement or not any engagement that suggested there's any vulnerability there, what more could you do? Now, I would argue there's still more that we can do. We can look at, we talked about data earlier, we can look at different touch points within that area. So where you've got no engagement whatsoever along the line, is that because somebody's scared and fearful and therefore there's some vulnerability there that we need to surface? So do we need to look at the collections language and look at the collections path before we continue? Do we need to go and get some external data before we continue? So I think there's more that can be done. Your other question around what's happening at the moment, yes, force fitting of prepayment meters has been stopped. And we saw this sort of thing happen a decade ago where the supply chain for prepayment meters became much, much slower. So what we then saw was customers building up a debt and getting more and more into debt because they couldn't manage it. And we were asking people to pay what they could on a weekly basis, going into the post office or that sort of mechanism to try and get them into the habit of paying frequently. But of course, that's just not how it works. And if somebody has £5 left at the end of the week and the energy's coming into the house without any issue whatsoever, and they've been told by their supplier, we can't put a prepaid meter in for you at the moment unless it's by appointment, then it does exacerbate the situation. And it certainly did then, where what we ended up with was when you get the prepayment meter installed, the size of the debts was 20, 30, 40% higher than what they would have been if we'd got the meter in the first place. The prepayment meter is a tool. It's a tool for collections companies. It's a tool for customers to help them to get out of debt. And the sooner that they get into that habit of paying regularly and paying down their debt, the better for them.
Yeah, but I suppose in that case, it's also a tool for the customer to help them control their energy uses, because it comes as a signal, doesn't it, in terms of like how much energy you. Because the big thing is, if you're on postpaid, is it comes a surprise because you've left the immersion on, let's say, for by mistake. I mean, we all do it, and it's what have I done, sort of thing, where it's just caps it, even though you sort of do it. And but I suppose going back to the media incident that happened, which is it feels we're very easy to make broad brush statements around collections or around energy companies and those kinds, but really it comes down to everyone's situation is different and is individual, and that's what the energy companies have to deal with, is almost like customers on an individual basis. And I go back to your piece around data and AI. Let's talk a bit about tech. How far along the road do you think we are in terms of getting down to almost like individualized, bespoke service for customers?
Yeah, I think we're quite a bit away from that in energy and water. We're still at a stage where we're talking about digital improvement. We're still talking about self-serve. There's a limited amount of companies that have bots in their processes with limited application and benefit at the moment. So I think certainly in the energy market, you have certain customers that were attracted to technology-driven companies. So the likes of Bulb and Octopus and Pure Planet, they certainly attracted a certain type of customer. Now that the market has become, I guess, a little bit more bland, it's Big Six plus a number of others that are shouting for who they think their customers are. So you've got the greener suppliers, you've got the standard suppliers, and you've got the sort of what used to be the disruptors of the likes of Ovo and Octopus that are still shouting from the rooftops what they're about. So I think there's limited application in the retail market. However, smart homes that help to get us to net zero, that's where we're seeing a lot of AI. There's a number of companies in the UK now that are balancing battery, solar, and home consumption to such an extent that at certain times of the year, for prolonged periods, your energy bill could be zero because they're balancing that on your behalf. So there's the AI and the algorithm that's working, excuse me, on your behalf, which in turn helps to balance the grid. Because if you're not drawing from the grid on a daily basis, then the grid is +1 essentially, because you've got more homes not consuming from the grid that usually would have been.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, and going back to financial services, if I look at financial services, we've got consumer duty coming up, and the FCA's put that in. A lot of that's got to do with customer treatment, how you treat customers, looking around, treating them fairly, looking around vulnerability, etc. Do you think some of those ideas from financial services will get translated into the utility space? I know some of them have already, but how much further do you think it's got to go?
Yeah, so you tend to see the FCA and Ofgem chatting and Ofwat chatting about these sorts of things, and some of that being shared. And interestingly, in the collection space, our collections teams tend to hear about these things more because they're working with debt collection agencies and collections partners that are being managed in this way. So the first time I heard about TCF, for instance, treating customers fairly, was when I was working with a collections partner that said, "Oh, hang on, we can't do that because that's not treating customers fairly." So it's an interesting dynamic where you've got your collections partner almost having a higher standard of how to handle vulnerable customers because they're being governed by the FCA, and Ofgem hasn't quite caught up with that yet, or you haven't quite caught up with that because that's not where you're specialising in.
Yeah. It does feel like it's cascading throughout the different industries, even down to local governments as well. I mean, just over time, I'd be interested to see what happens after July, both in financial services, but then in a broader kind of aspect as well. And then lastly, I was going to ask you a little bit about your leadership blog and your leadership work as well, and just ask you about leadership generally, I suppose, in terms of how do you think that's changing, and what do you think the requirements are, particularly in the utility space, of what kind of leadership do we need going forward, and what are going to be the key things, do you think, are going to be the key characteristics for future leaders?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we're seeing a lot more of now is transparent, open, and authentic leadership. We're not hearing about leaders that are getting up at 4 o'clock, doing 20-hour days, and holding perfection up as the operating model. What we're hearing more about are leaders talking about their mental health struggles. We're hearing about leaders that talk about, "Hey guys, I've got a family, so I'm knocking off at 4 o'clock today. So I'm not expecting this craziness of working hard all of the time." Now, I think we're seeing a shift away from the wearing how many hours work you did like a loyalty badge to that more transparent, working smarter rather than harder approach. And I think equally, trust was a big issue during the pandemic. So we saw lots of people that had never worked from home because their businesses wouldn't allow it, having to work from home and realizing all the fears of our teams working from home didn't really come to pass. I think we saw a lot of trust being rewarded. So yeah, I think going into the future, we'll see a lot more of those businesses that will have that authentic, open, and transparent leadership mopping up the talent around them. And that means that kind of hybrid working would play a massive part in that, because if you are a business operating with hybrid and you can really pick people up from anywhere in the UK or even globally in some instances, then you can attract talent that previously you weren't able to.
Yeah.
I'd also say we haven't really touched on diversity and inclusion at all. And certainly diversity and inclusion within collections, within credit risk, within the energy industry absolutely needs to improve, because we need to understand our customers. And we hear lots from CEOs of energy companies talking about we have to represent the communities in which we live in and serve. A great way of doing that is making sure that your teams are diverse, you're operating in an inclusive way, but in a way that it's legacy forming rather than tick boxing. So you go away from saying we have a black woman on our board and that's the tick. Great, we've done that now. Or our HR manager is a woman. You move away from those things and you talk more about the processes. So what about our recruitment approaches? What about our job descriptions? How inclusive are we? And if you were to look at our processes from onboarding right the way through our teams and how we're looking after people, are they designed to create the best possible outcomes for all of our people or not?
It does feel, just on diversity and inclusion, it does feel even through the whole boom we've had around AI, is there seems to be a much greater awareness around things like bias and hidden bias and those kind of things than it feels like we had before, where it did seem to be like headline grabbing tick box exercises. But I think that deeper understanding, that deeper cultural understanding makes a big difference in some of those kind of areas.
It does. Yeah, definitely.
And the trust aspect, having worked in collections, it's very easy to think that everyone's not paying, whereas the fact is always remind people that the vast majority of people are good people. Even the people in collections are good people as well. They've just come into difficult situations, but that's a trust piece as well. And the same with businesses or employees. They're really driven by employees, and that sort of trust piece
Yeah,
is so super important. So it's good to hear that that's improving as well. So yeah,
yeah, yeah,
so
certainly.
so certainly looking forward to the future. I think you're certainly optimistic. So that's good. We'll definitely watch that space. So Ian, thanks very much for making the time for me today. I really appreciate it, and super interesting to get a real sort of expert insight into the energy industry and water as well. So thanks very much.
No worries. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.